Hello ladies, I figured if I'm going to video, I might as well do it outside where it is a beautiful day today before the rain shows up tomorrow. This week's Doctrine Talk is on the cross for a believer, the cross for a believer. And this week Peter challenged, actually starting last week, Peter is challenging believers to live like Christ and submit to the will of God, even if that means persecution and suffering. Did you catch the part this week in chapter 3 where Peter said, in the same way to both the wives and to the husbands in chapter 3 before he continued with his plea? He was referring back to chapter 2 where he introduced the idea of submitting as unto the Lord. So how do we do this? Well, we look to the cross, and that's why it's our doctrine this week. We look to Jesus. Jesus said in Matthew 26:39, "Yet not as I will, but as you will." And again in Matthew 26:42, "If this cannot pass away unless I drink it, your will be done." What was that cup? It was the cup of suffering. And suffering for us while submitting to the will of the Father. And one of my favorite books is the book of Philippians. Woo, I almost dropped my paper. And in Philippians 2, verses 5-9, it says, "Have this attitude in yourselves, which was also in Christ Jesus, who, although he existed in the form of God, did not regard equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself, taking the form of a bondservant and being made in the likeness of men." Yes, ladies, we really can submit to the will of our Father as we keep our eyes on Jesus, on what he did on the cross, how he humbled himself to the Father's will. So the cross for a believer, it is a call to personally and willingly identify with and live like Jesus. Jesus suffered and he was crucified to fulfill God's will. The cross for a believer involves the death of one's own desires. The death of one's own desires to follow God's will, just as Jesus did. The cross for a believer is temporary, yet it yields fruit for eternity. When I believe the cross for a believer is necessary, I daily surrender my plans so I can take on God's agenda no matter the cost. But when I do not believe the cross for a believer is necessary, my needs and desires are prioritized, and my focus is vengeance against anyone who causes me pain or distress. So 2 takeaways for you leaders today. This is so much harder, by the way. I definitely prefer walking around a room and talking to you face to face. I feel silly talking to myself. Here goes. 2 applications for us ladies. The first is that believers join in Christ's sufferings when we deny personal desires and ambition in order to do God's will. So how has your personal view of suffering kept you from experiencing the intimate walk with Christ you so desire? Do you run away from suffering and miss out on an opportunity to know Christ in a more intimate way? When have you experienced God's empowering to lay aside your rights for another? What does that reveal about God's work in you? And lastly, for point number 1, how does experiencing Christ's response to you when you were his enemy? Remember, he died for us while we were still his enemies. How does that influence your response to those who have hurt you? This one's hard. Our second application is that God uses the process of dying to self to make us more like Christ. Believers who die to their desires to follow God's will experience inner changes that reflect Christ's character. So where have you seen God bring good out of self-denial or self-sacrifice in your life? Christ lived the ultimate life of self-denial, and he knows how to empower and comfort you as you follow in his footsteps. So where is Christ challenging you to deny yourself in some way today, or maybe this week, or maybe over the next month? Not for your glory, but for his. Ladies, I am praying with you and for you as we all walk this walk together, and I'm so thankful for each and every one of you.